On a Friday afternoon in May 1980, a quiet California town suddenly sounded like a war zone: explosions, automatic gunfire, police cars shredded by rifle rounds, a law enforcement helicopter spiraling toward the ground, dozens of officers pinned down along a 25-mile stretch of roads and foothills. This wasn't a battlefield in Vietnam. It wasn't a movie set. It was a bank robbery. Today, we're breaking down the Norco 1980 bank robbery, the heist that turned California into a war zone and changed American policing and SWAT tactics forever. My name is Your Name, and this is Channel Name. This video is for educational and documentary purposes only. We do not glorify crime or violence in any way. Watch until the end, because the way this case ended says a lot about how the United States reacts when ordinary crime suddenly looks like full-scale combat. Norco, California, in 1980 didn't look like the kind of place that would end up in true crime documentaries. It was a semi-rural town in Riverside County, horse properties, modest homes, open spaces. The kind of community where a bank robbery might make the local paper and be forgotten a week later. But a small group of men in Southern California had a much bigger and much more dangerous idea. Their names were George Wayne Smith Christopher Harvin Russell, Harvin James William Jimmy Muniz Manuel Manny Delgado. Later reports and court records describe them as heavily into survivalist and apocalyptic beliefs. They thought society might collapse, and they wanted money to build their own survival compound. To get that money, they chose a target: a Security Pacific Bank branch in Norco, California. On paper, it was just a bank heist. Walk in, take the cash, get away. The way they armed themselves is what turned it into something else entirely. The Norco robbers did not show up with a couple of handguns and ski masks. They came equipped like they were preparing for a battle. According to investigators and trial testimony, the group brought military-style semi-automatic rifles, shotguns, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and improvised explosives stored in their vehicle. They had also modified a van for the job, stocking it with weapons, ammunition, and supplies to sustain a prolonged fight if things went wrong. Now compare that to the average patrol officer's gear in 1980 California. A .38 caliber revolver on their belt. Maybe a 12-gauge shotgun in the patrol car, that's it, no patrol rifles. Limited body armor. SWAT-level gear was rare and usually not immediately available. So when these 5 men walked into a bank in Norco, it was technically a bank robbery, but they were armed like a small paramilitary unit. The gap between what they had and what the police had was about to explode into public view. Friday, May 9, 1980, at around 3:40 p.m., the 5 men entered the Security Pacific Bank in Norco. They were masked and heavily armed. Inside, customers and employees suddenly found themselves staring down the barrels of rifles and shotguns. The robbers demanded money. People hit the floor. In those first moments, this was a terrifying but standard armed robbery. Outside, though, everything was already changing. A witness noticed something was wrong and called the police. An alarm was triggered inside the bank. A radio call went out: possible robbery in progress. Riverside County Sheriff's deputies responded. Among the first was Deputy Glenn Belaski. He had no idea he was driving toward one of the most intense gunfights in modern American law enforcement history. As the robbers exited the bank and climbed into their modified van, Deputy Belaski arrived on scene. The moment he pulled up, the suspects opened fire with rifles. High-powered rounds ripped through his patrol car. One bullet shattered the windshield and struck him. Others slammed into the car's steering and braking systems, sending his vehicle out of control and into a pole. Despite being wounded and under heavy fire, Belaski managed to return fire with his shotgun, hitting the van and even wounding one of the suspects. In seconds, a quiet intersection in Norco had turned into a frontline firefight. Automatic-style rifle fire from the suspects, shotgun blasts from responding deputies, civilians diving for cover and running for their lives, more units racing to the scene, only to find themselves outgunned. What had started as an armed robbery had already become a gun battle. The robbers then made a critical decision. They fled. What followed was not just a getaway. It was a high-speed running gunfight that turned part of California into a literal war zone. Leaving the bank, the suspects sped out of Norco in their van, heading out of town and eventually toward more rural roads and foothills. Riverside County deputies went after them. Soon, officers from other agencies, including the California Highway Patrol, joined the pursuit. This was nothing like a normal police chase. The suspects, fired rifles out the back of their van at pursuing officers, threw improvised explosives to damage or block patrol cars, hit police vehicles with high-powered bullets. Patrol cars had windows blown out, body panels punched through by rifle rounds, tires shredded. Officers were calling for backup, trying to coordinate under extreme stress and limited radio bandwidth. At one point, the suspects abandoned their damaged van, hijacked a pickup truck at gunpoint, and continued their violent escape. The chase and gun battle covered more than 25 miles, moving from Norco out toward the San Gabriel Mountains, near an area called Lytle Creek. During this running gunfight, the suspects also aimed at a police helicopter. They hit it with rifle fire, forcing the helicopter to crash land. The crew survived, but they were injured. Think about what that means. A group of bank robbers had just forced down a law enforcement helicopter in Southern California, in broad daylight. By this point, dozens of officers from multiple agencies were engaged. Roads were littered with shell casings and damaged vehicles. Radio channels were chaotic. For those involved, this didn't feel like a robbery gone wrong. It felt like a war. The chase finally pushed into the rugged foothills near Lytle Creek. There, the suspects stopped and set up defensive positions. They knew officers were coming. They were still armed with rifles, ammunition, and explosives. They prepared to make a stand. As law enforcement units approached, a brutal firefight broke out. Thousands of rounds were exchanged in the hills and brush of Southern California. During this final gun battle, Riverside County Sheriff's Deputy James Evans was shot and killed. He was struck in the head by a rifle round while attempting to engage the suspects. His death shocked his department, his family, and the surrounding community. In the end, 2 suspects, including George Smith and Manny Delgado, were killed in the shootout. The remaining 3, Christopher Harvin, Russell Harvin, and Jimmy Muniz, were captured alive and taken into custody. The Norco 1980 bank robbery and shootout was finally over on the ground. But its impact on American law enforcement was just beginning. In the months and years that followed, the surviving suspects faced a long list of charges: armed bank robbery, multiple counts of attempted murder, and the murder of Deputy James Evans under the felony murder rule. All of them could be held responsible for Evans' death, even if they hadn't fired the exact shot that killed him, because it happened during the commission of a violent felony. During the trials, prosecutors laid out in detail how heavily armed the Norco bank robbers were, how many officers were wounded, how a police helicopter was forced down, how civilians were terrorized during the chase, how much destruction they caused over those 25 miles. The surviving robbers were convicted and sentenced to long terms in prison, effectively spending the rest of their lives behind bars. For the families of victims, for the deputies who survived the Norco shootout, and for the town itself, the emotional scars lasted far beyond the headlines. But Norco 1980 also had a national impact. It forced police departments across the United States to ask a difficult question: what happens when criminals are better armed than the police? Before the Norco 1980 bank robbery, many American police departments, especially smaller and suburban ones, looked very different from what we see today. Standard patrol gear often meant a revolver, a shotgun in the car, limited or no rifle access, basic body armor, if any. Specialized SWAT teams existed, but they were fewer, less standardized, and not always nearby when something went wrong. The Norco shootout changed how many departments thought about that. The Norco 1980 case showed, very clearly, that some criminals were willing to arm themselves like soldiers. As a result, more departments began issuing patrol rifles, such as AR-15 type platforms, to regular officers. SWAT teams expanded in size, training, and capability. Investment increased in body armor, communications, and interagency coordination. Supporters of these changes argued, we can't send officers with 6-shot revolvers to face suspects with high-powered rifles and explosives. They need the right tools to survive, critics warned. Events like Norco are rare. If we base everyday policing on the worst-case scenario, we risk turning the streets into a permanent battlefield, whichever side you're on. There's no question that the Norco 1980 bank robbery and shootout became a major turning point. A single California bank robbery helped push American policing toward the heavily armed, SWAT-driven model we recognize today. So why did this bank robbery turn California into a war zone? Because in Norco, in 1980, 5 heavily armed men brought war-level firepower to a small town bank. They turned a robbery into a 25-mile running gun battle. They shot down a police helicopter. They killed Deputy James Evans in a final firefight in the foothills. This wasn't just another robbery gone wrong. It was a collision between two eras, an older style of everyday policing, and a new reality where some criminals were willing to fight like a military unit. In the end, 2 suspects died in the mountains. 3 went to prison for life. 1 deputy never went home. And dozens of officers and families were changed forever. And beyond the headlines, the Norco 1980 bank robbery turned California into a war zone, and it helped reshape how America trains and equips its police. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think about the Norco 1980 bank robbery and shootout? Was the police response the only option they had? Did this event push necessary changes, or did it help accelerate the militarization of policing in America? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you found this breakdown helpful or eye-opening, hit the like button. It really helps the video reach more people. Subscribe to Obscured Crimes for more deep-dive true crime and history stories like this bank robbery turned California into a war zone, Norco 1980. And tell me which case you want to see next. The North Hollywood shootout? The Geezer Bandit? Another American bank robbery that changed history? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.